Thanks everyone for joining me for cybersecurity lessons from my Kung Fu instructor. Now this is actually a concept that I've been thinking about for a long time, but it's really just gelled for me over maybe the last month or so, exactly how martial arts in general and Kung Fu in specific relates to how we practice cybersecurity and some of the teachings that it has that would be applicable to the ways in which we protect endpoints and protect our networks. And I've been studying martial arts for a long time. I did fencing in high school and college. I studied Kung Fu for 10 years. And while these were not really the best choices for business, I mean, golf is a much better choice if you want to be negotiating with people. It's easier to discuss a contract over, the fifth hole on the fairway rather than while you're trying to kick them in the head. But it does maybe have more to do with cybersecurity than golf, although maybe someone else could write a webinar on that. And it has some key lessons that apply into the cybersecurity realm. My first lesson in Kung Fu was back in 1998. And I hadn't been doing anything athletic in a long time and was way out of shape. And so I'm there with the instructor, and he's putting me through this routine of blocks. I'm doing inward block, inward block, inward block, upward, upward, downward, downward. And he's throwing punches one after another. And I'm just blocking and blocking and blocking and blocking and getting more and more tired and more sloppy. He keeps shouting at me to block and block and block. And finally, I was so out of shape and so exhausted, I just said, okay, wait, we got to stop here for a minute. I need to catch my breath. And while he sort of looked at me dubiously and wondered whether I'd ever actually come back for another lesson, he started talking about the philosophy of blocking attacks and said, now, we're spending a lot of time teaching you how to block, but actually this is in many ways the least effective tool in your toolbox for dealing with attacks. We're going to teach you how to block all of these things. But he said, really, the best way to deal with an attack is not to be there, which sounded to me like the worst, most hackneyed piece of Kung Fu movie philosophy I had ever heard. But I decided that wasn't enough to make me leave, and I continued to study with them and continued to learn more. And eventually really realized that there was something to that this whole concept of avoiding the attack, not being there when the attack lands, is actually a very powerful idea and applies to, in fact, many parts of life, but certainly applies to cybersecurity and how we define our defenses. Now, ironically, I just started going back to fencing. Instead of Olympic fencing, which is what this photo is, I actually just started studying Renaissance rapier fencing and going back to with a heavier sword and traditional manuals and books that describe fighting techniques from the Renaissance, from the Elizabethan period. And first lesson, they're talking about, okay, someone's stabbing you and you're going to put your sword here and here's how you block the attack. But what you really want to be doing is getting out of the way of the sword, and that block then is an insurance policy. And that's what really got me wanting to do this webinar, is realizing that I was seeing this pattern over and over, that it's always better to be avoiding the attack rather than just trying to block that incoming attack. And so let's take a look at blocking first and how that applies to cybersecurity. So blocking means there's an incoming attack coming at you, and you're going to intercept it and prevent it from impacting and causing damage. And it's really the most instinctual reaction we have, right? If someone's punching at you, if they're kicking at you, if they throw something at you, the instinct is to try to put up an arm, wave your hand by, try to knock that thing out of the way and prevent it from contacting you. And that's really been the same instinct we've had online. I think blocking is very much similar to detection-based security. There's some sort of threat, there's malware, there's a probe coming in. You're going to notice that it's coming in and then take action to prevent it from hitting you. You're going to block it proactively. And so, all of our firewalls, all of our malware scanners, all of those things are really following that approach. And you're trying to stop that attack from impacting on you. The problem is twofold. First, you have to be able to recognize the attack. So the reason blocking is ineffective in martial arts is I need to spot the attack coming in early enough to get my arm up to prevent the attack from hitting. And if I'm a little too early, I'll whiff by in the air. If I'm too late, they've already hit me. If it was a fake, they may be coming in on a different angle and I will have missed the block again. You actually need to have the timing and precision to intercept that attack to successfully block it. And we have the same problem in cybersecurity, where when that attack's coming in, you need to recognize it as an attack. Right? You need to see that that's malware. You need to recognize that that piece of network traffic is hostile and should be blocked. And if you have a false negative detection, that means it gets through, right? That malware, the 0-day attack didn't get detected. The malware with a new signature didn't get picked up. The hostile traffic went through. The exfiltration of data happened. Whatever that situation is, if you didn't successfully detect it, you're not going to be able to stop it from happening. And we know the attackers are getting very good at doing those sort of feints, at getting evasive, at preventing you from being able to easily detect that attack coming in and put up your defenses. So blocking leads to problems because you're not always able to successfully do the block, right? You're not always able to intercept that attack. But blocking also has another aspect, and that is the pain of blocking. When you try to block an attack, it can hurt you almost as much as it's effective at stopping the attacker. And I saw this firsthand when my parents were in Kung Fu. They started in their 60s, I think, and they were sparring each other. And my mother, who we call Iron Legs Cottrell, was throwing a roundhouse at my father, and he quickly did a downward block and intercepted my mom's shin with his forearm. Unfortunately, there's sort of a rock, paper, scissors that goes on with this, and shin versus forearm, shin wins, and she actually broke my dad's arm right there. And the same thing happens in cybersecurity, where you're getting false positive detections, right? So you're blocking the attacks you want to block, but you're self-inflicting damage by blocking things you didn't want to block as well, right? You're accidentally flagging a valid file as malware. You're blocking legitimate URLs that someone's trying to get to because that you haven't seen them before, or they match some sort of criteria, or they've got keywords. You're preventing emails from coming in that you wanted to get. All of these blocking techniques are going to block things that you actually wanted to get, as well as things that you intended to block, the malware, the attacks, and so forth. And so these false positive detections inflict their own damage on an organization, right? They get in the way of the business of doing business. The people in your organization are trying to get things done. They're trying to send emails. They're trying to do contracts. They're trying to log into servers, get information, do research. All of these activities that take place online and with our IT infrastructure. And every time they're prevented from doing that, there's a real cost of business there. As well, if that becomes too common, we then see people start to circumvent our security. So people then start to bypass our systems and pull out their phone or find some other way of accessing things. And now they've stepped out from behind the shield. There's no blocking taking place at all. And there's a free-for-all, and who knows what's going to happen to them at that point. So blocking, while it is effective, has these problems, right? You can hurt yourself. You've got to be precise. Things get through. You're going to either block things you didn't want to block and fail to block things that you wanted to block. So let's get back to that Kung Fu philosophy. How do we not be there? I think fundamentally there's three approaches to not being there that I learned. The first is dodging, right? You just get out of the way of the attack. The second is maintaining range. So you're going to stay away from the attacker, make it so they can't hit you directly. And the third is to avoid the fight completely. Just don't let that attack happen. So let's take a look at those one at a time, how they apply in martial arts and how they apply in real life. So the first is the dodge. This is the most direct way of avoiding an attack. You see someone's foot coming at your face, you're going to try to get your face out of the way of it. You're going to lean back, duck, twist to the side, try to avoid that attack from happening. This requires less precise timing. You just need to move that target away from the impactor. It's also fairly instinctual. In this case, I think the analogy is to look at what is the thing they're trying to attack and how can you get it out of the way. So when people are attacking your systems, they're typically not, putting little clip wires onto your CPU and feeding data in directly. They're usually not physical attacks at all, right? We're normally looking at people who are trying to send you malware by email or malicious files or websites that have hostile content that's trying to get through to you. And what you want to do is dodge by avoiding using the things that they can attack. So if someone is going after an exploit in Windows or an exploit in Adobe Acrobat with weaponized PDF or your browser Flash plugin, for example, those attacks are almost always aimed at those platforms. Right? A malicious PDF exploit doesn't work on any PDF reader. It only works on the specific one it was built for. And the attackers, because of the way the economy of malware works, are always being very selective about getting the most impact for the dollars they spend building the tools that they have. And so they don't write exploits in general against some PDF reader you've never heard of that a couple hundred people use, right? They're going to focus all of their efforts on going after Adobe Acrobat because that's the 500-pound gorilla. People write malware primarily for Windows because there's an awful lot more Windows users than Mac. Not necessarily because Macs are inherently more secure, but just you're going to get more prey if you go after the common prey animal. That's what's out there. So you can dodge that attack then by using platforms that aren't what the attackers are attacking, right? If they're trying to hit you with your Acrobat reader, using a third party, a different PDF reader avoids all of those attacks. It dodges those attacks completely. The person's going to try to hit you and they're just going to whiff and hit air. Right? If they're trying to do a Windows exploit, which almost all of them end up trying to do, they're dumping some exe file at the end of the day. If you're running a Mac, or even better yet, maybe running a Linux platform, almost no one is writing malware against that. Now, there will always be that ninja attacker who handcrafted malware just for you, right? They know what your operating system is. They've researched you. It's a spear attack, and they're going to try to get through that anyway. But the vast, vast, vast majority of the malware that you're going to encounter is written for the most common case. And so if you can just avoid using those particular applications, those operating systems, those platforms, where they can be attacked, those attacks don't land at all. Now, the next idea, and I've seen this throughout all of my martial arts, is maintaining range. And so if we look at this photo, neither of these people at this moment can hit each other, right? Their arms are not long enough. The sword's not long enough. From where they stand, they're both safe at this moment. Now, of course, either of these people could take a step forward, close the distance, and then attack. But they've got to take that step and close the distance. They've got to take another action before they can actually have an impact on you, your body, the thing you care about. So what we'd like to be able to do is do the same game online, right? We want to be able to see that person trying to close the range and be able to take a step backwards, get out of the way, keep them at that distance. And the analogy that occurred to me for this is moving the attack surface away from you. And again, the attack surface that people can hit is generally those applications that you're using. It's, in so many cases, it's the browser. And so rather than having the browser sitting right on your desktop, so that once you get the browser, you get the desktop and immediately you're doing damage, right? Because that's where the valuable stuff is. That's where the files are. That's where you have access to credentials. You can sniff the keyboard. I can get passwords. I can get access to your accounts. Or all the bad stuff happens when I'm able to compromise your desktop. If I can not allow that attack surface, the browser, to be on the desktop, I can impose that kind of distance. So I could, for example, run the browser inside a virtual machine on my desktop or in a remote machine somewhere. And now if the attacker manages to compromise the browser, they're still not close to where they need to be to attack me. They now need to close that distance from where the browser lives to where I'm actually working. They need to do a breakout from the VM. They need to somehow try to push an exploit down from the remote server. if I'm looking at PDFs, for example, maybe I have the PDFs render into an image or some other format at some remote location before it comes through to me. So now the attacker actually needs to somehow compromise that remote thing to get the attack to make it all the way to me. And so that allows me to have that distance in place between the stuff I want to protect, right? My actual operating system and all of my files and my local networks, and the thing that they can actually attack. So that allows me to maintain range. And these things play really well together. Right, the best case scenario is you want to both dodge and be out of range at the same time. That's sort of belt and suspenders. It gives you that extra level of insurance. And so this actually is a very easy thing to do. Once you're, say, looking at putting the browser inside a virtual machine, you can look at putting a different browser inside the virtual machine, or put a virtual machine that's running Linux instead of Windows in that environment. So not only is it hard to get from there to your desktop, but at the same time, it's hard to even exploit the environment because it's not the environment that the attackers are expecting. So in this case, right, you've got a browser, maybe Opera, running in a virtual machine on your desktop, or that PDF being rendered by some small third-party app that people aren't familiar with in a remote location. And by combining those, you get a multiplier effect, and it gives you a much stronger, more robust security in depth kind of solution. And it's a much more effective way of not being there when the attack arrives. And most zen of these is avoiding the attack, right? How do you not be in the fight in the first place? And this is what they always talked about. How many stories start? I was in a bar, or someone was walking through a neighborhood wearing the wrong colors, in a gang neighborhood, or you look at assassinations. Assassins don't target random people; they're going after some very specific individual. By changing what you look like and where you are and how you're behaving, you can avoid many attacks, particularly targeted attacks in the online scenario. Increasingly, we're seeing nation states and criminal organizations and all sorts of hackers moving towards highly targeted attacks. And they do this because they're fundamentally more effective, right? If I'm going to send malware to 1 million people, I know that this is going to get detected pretty quickly. It's going to get characterized. They're going to make detection rules about it, set up indicators of compromise so they can see when this malware is operating inside your network. There's a whole set of reactions that take place that then counteract your effectiveness. If you go in with one attack that's novel against one person or a small group of people, it's much harder to detect. Right? You don't see the spikes of activity. You're unlikely to hit honeypots. You're unlikely to accidentally try to infect a malware researcher or a bot that's scanning the website. In fact, so like the Forbes website was compromised a couple of years ago, and it was the quote of the day, that page that you log into Forbes and you get that sort of pithy message before the actual website comes up. And an attacker went in and compromised that to push malware down on visitors, but not all visitors. They actually set it up so that only people who appeared to be US DoD or Chinese dissidents actually got the malware, which meant that all the systems that were scanning Forbes, looking to see if there was malware being propagated, never saw anything. And when it got reported, the security researchers went in, and they didn't get attacked either. I mean, eventually they were able to discover what was going on and launch a defense and clean it out, but it took much longer than it would have otherwise. And this can be taken to a much greater degree, and we're seeing this now with individualized spear attacks. I think the most extreme case of targeting that I've heard of was a case called Dark Hotel, where the attackers went in and compromised a number of top-end hotels in Asia and infected both the Wi-Fi networks in the hotel and the reservation systems. And so they'd wait until they would see a high-value target. The person that they wanted to go after was going to be visiting the hotel, and they'd put their attack in place. And what happens when you go to a hotel and you log into the Wi-Fi? Well, the first thing it asks you for is your last name and your hotel room number. Well, because they'd compromised the reservation system, they knew the person's last name, of course, that's their target, and they knew the hotel room number they were going to be in. So when they infected the Wi-Fi, they only launched the malware against the specific individual when they logged in and identified themselves as part of the login process. And then they'd infect the computer, and then they laid silent for a couple of months so that it wouldn't attract suspicion and then attack the system. But this is really becoming an increasing trend for people to be more impactful. And of course, it does more damage when it lands, because with a targeted attack, the attacker has worked out what they want to have happen. Right? They know who they're going after, how they're going to use the information, how they're going to do the dumps, what they're going to do to the financial records they find, whatever the target of the attack is, they already have plans for exploiting that. And that allows them to maximize their benefit and the victim's pain simultaneously. The key to avoiding this then is to not look like the target. You don't want to look like the person they're going after. And so that could mean, in the real world, don't wear the wrong gang colors in the wrong place. Don't drive in an open-top car if you're the president. But, you see people, celebrities will travel in disguise. They'll wear sunglasses. They'll, grow a beard. They'll try to avoid notice. In this case, their threat model is the paparazzi. When you're going online, when you're going to websites, you can do the same thing. You can prevent the site from recognizing who you are. If they can't recognize you, then that attack literally never happens to you, because you look like the population that they're trying not to attack, right? The people they're trying to avoid. So on the web, there's several ways they can try to identify you, right? There's your IP address. If you're coming out of a fixed IP at your home or your corporate location, that can really tag you. But it isn't just the overtly identified ones that you need to worry about. Any IP address that's associated with your organization or you in a larger way can identify you. So for example, if you're in a corporate building and there's a Starbucks in the basement, but you basically own the whole building, then that Starbucks is going to be pretty tightly associated with your organization. People will discover that Starbucks is connected to that business or that government entity or what have you. And that doesn't become very effective. So ideally, you want an IP address that's completely unassociated with you or your organization and is geographically remote. If you're in Washington, D.C., you want to look like you're in Peoria, Illinois, or in Amsterdam, or somewhere radically different from where you actually are. Of course, then there's trackers, there's cookies, and we all are getting inundated with cookies all the time. That are identifying you, because you log into websites and that contains identifying information. So those you can scrub out. And of course, something like incognito mode will deal with cookies. But then there's super cookies, right? There's various kinds of trackers that exploit the way Flash or JavaScript or browsers can store information or store history. And you can embed identifying information in that. And that's widely done. So if you're using the same browser to visit these websites, you may be exposed because people can see that they've laid a tracker on you that you can't delete easily, and when you come back trying to be sneaky, oh, I recognize you, you were here before, or I see your Facebook token, or what have you. So you really need to make sure that you scrub all of those trackers. And then the most difficult to deal with is your browser fingerprint. So you're trying to hide on the internet, but it turns out your browser wants to tell everyone a huge amount of information. So when you go to a website, you're telling it some of the obvious things, right? What's your operating system? What version? What browser? What version? But it shows things like all the plugins you have installed and which versions, and to some extent, what order you installed them. Same with fonts. Every single font on your system, and with some information about the order in which they were installed, which additional ones you have, what character sets you support, what languages you support, what your time zone is. And then there's other information that they can pull out actually about your video drivers and your video cards. Huge amount of data that it turns out to be enough to uniquely identify you as a visitor to almost any website in the world. And even with enough redundancy that even as that changes slightly, they can continue to recognize you and just update their fingerprint. That's a hard one to deal with. Really, the key there is you need to be using a browser that's not your normal browser, and ideally one that has a very common fingerprint. So your best bet is to be using a clean install in a virtual machine that you restore back to its original setting each time you're going to start a session, because that pristine browser environment is going to be the most common fingerprint out there. It will be shared with the largest number of other people. Ideally, if this is a common public image that you're using, that'll maximize the number of other people that you would be confused with and make it as difficult as possible to uniquely track you, because you're just not giving out that very specific browser fingerprint that they've got. So for example, if you're using a virtual browser inside your virtual machine, the nice thing is also when you roll back the VM, it destroys all the super cookies and the cookies and everything else. As long as you're using some sort of a VPN to connect out to either a public anonymity service, a private service, a server that you've leased somewhere, not under your real name out on the internet, you'll be able to hide your IP address. That then gives you a solid package for hiding your identity. Email's harder, right? Because we give email addresses out to everyone and we're expecting inbound communications. So that's extremely difficult to support for any but the most extreme cases. You can, for example, have a public email address that's well known for you, but that goes through extreme vetting and maybe is only viewed inside some sort of a secure bubble. But you have a private email address that you give people that's not in your corporate domain, that changes on a regular basis, that you actually have come more directly to you, that's the one you actually engage with on a day-to-day basis. Certainly if you're doing any kind of undercover activity, it makes sense to support that, but it's a non-trivial undertaking to manage an anonymous email system to avoid targeting by email. Certainly possible, but probably a more limited use case compared to just avoiding web-based targeting. And all of these avoidance techniques really should be combined with the blocking, right? I'm not in any way suggesting that you should not try to block attacks, that blocking is a useless endeavor. We still need to have those detection-based things, right? You want to see attacks coming in, you want to recognize malware, you certainly want to have a behavior and anomaly-based detection to look for whether an attack has somehow succeeded through a channel that you haven't sufficiently protected, but that should really be a backstop to avoiding the attack in the first place. You want to have your systems architected in such a way that you are dodging, keeping range, and avoiding targeted attacks when possible with those detection-based securities then as a backstop if those other systems aren't providing sufficient protection. But that then makes it easier to optimize the level of blocking, so you're not necessarily having to turn your blocking detector up to 11 and generate all of those false positives that you want to avoid and annoy your users. So along with blocking, you want to remember the dodge, using applications that aren't the ones the malware is written for, right? Using alternate operating systems, using alternate PDF readers, don't use Microsoft Office, use maybe a third-party Office reader for any files that are in any way questionable. You want to maintain your range. Make that attack surface, that thing that can get exploited, make sure that's not right next to where you are, right? That's not on your desktop where all your valuables are, where the crown jewels reside. You want to have that thing that can be hurt far away with nothing important in it, and then give them a really hard job to close the distance from there all the way through to where your actual good stuff is. And finally, if you can and where appropriate, avoid the attacks, right? Don't just give everyone your identity and announce to everyone where you're going around, have your name across the front of your shirt and a big target painted on your back. There's no need to do that. So for most of your online activities, there's no reason not to be taking advantage of at least a reasonable level of anonymity, just to make it a little more difficult for them to spot you. And in all those cases where there were targeted attacks coming against you, you may be able to just prevent that attack ever taking place in the first place. And then none of your other defenses even get tested because you just walked by and, it's kind of like Star Wars. These are not the droids you're looking for. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. We actually have some handouts. Obviously, Ntrepid does provide tools that support some of these kinds of solutions. We have anonymity technologies as well as isolation technologies. So you'll find inside the application a couple of handouts that you can download. And at the same time, I'd like to invite you to post any questions into the chat into the question section and be happy to answer them. And in the meantime, thanks so much for attending.